The first time my ex-husband looked our son in the eye after disappearing for 3 years, he wasn't there to apologize. He came with a lawyer and demanded $4.1 million. I remember the exact room. Conference Room B at Holloway and Pierce Law Offices in downtown Plano, Texas. It was a Tuesday morning in late September. Outside, the sky was bright and cloudless, and commuters were filling the sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands like it was any other ordinary day. Inside that conference room, my entire past had just walked through the door wearing an expensive navy suit. David hadn't changed much. His hair had a little more gray around the temples, but he still carried himself with the same confidence that used to fool people into thinking he was charming. He smiled when he saw me. I didn't smile back. His attorney slid a folder across the polished oak table. "We're here to discuss Mr. Lawson's parental rights regarding Ethan's defense contract." Parental rights. I almost laughed. Across from me sat Ethan, 18 years old now, quietly tracing the edge of a yellow legal pad with his thumb. He wasn't nervous. That's what surprised me most. Whenever things became loud or unpredictable, he usually withdrew into himself. Instead, he looked calm, almost curious. David folded his hands. "I think we can settle this without making it ugly." My attorney Linda Holloway glanced at me before speaking. "Mr. Lawson, your client voluntarily surrendered custody years ago." David shrugged. "That doesn't erase biology." There it was. Not my son. Not how has he been. Just biology. As though 18 years of someone's life could be reduced to a word in a law book. Linda leaned toward me. "We can fight this today if you want." I looked across the table at David. 3 years earlier, I would have exploded. 3 years earlier, I probably would have cried. Instead, I simply nodded. "Go ahead." David smiled, thinking I'd just made a mistake. Then I felt a gentle touch on my sleeve. Ethan leaned closer. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom," he smiled. He picked the wrong fight. Those 7 words settled over me like a warm blanket. For the first time since David had walked back into our lives, I wasn't afraid. Because Ethan knew something David didn't. And to explain that, I have to take you back 3 years. Back to the day I came home from Poland. I'd spent 9 months deployed with my Army Reserve Engineering Unit supporting NATO logistics near Rzeszów. Most days were long and cold. We repaired equipment, coordinated transport routes, and solved problems nobody back home ever heard about. I counted down the days until I could sleep in my own bed, drink real Texas coffee, and surprise my family. David's last text before my flight simply read, "Drive safe from the airport." Nothing unusual. Nothing that warned me my life had already been turned upside down. I landed at Dallas/Fort Worth International Airport just after 4 in the afternoon. The baggage carousel was crowded. Families hugged. Children ran into waiting arms. I wheeled my duffel bag toward the parking garage with that familiar feeling every service member knows, the quiet excitement of finally being home. I had no idea that home wasn't waiting for me anymore. By the time I reached our neighborhood in Plano, the sun was dropping behind the rows of brick houses, throwing long shadows across the sidewalks. Our garage door was open. David's SUV was gone. At first I thought he had run out for groceries. Then I noticed the trash bins still sitting at the curb even though pickup had been that morning. David never forgot things like that. He was careless with people but strangely particular about schedules. I carried my duffel inside. The house was too quiet. "David." No answer. I walked past the living room and found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table in the same gray hoodie he wore in most of the photos David had sent me. His headphones covered his ears, but no music was playing. He looked thinner. There was a bowl of dry cereal in front of him. "Hey, sweetheart." He didn't look up. I set my bag down and crouched beside him. "Where's your dad?" Ethan stared at one corner of the table. After nearly a minute, he said he left Thursday. It was Monday. I remember gripping the edge of the chair because my knees suddenly felt weak. "Who's been here with you?" "No one." There were 4 frozen pizza boxes in the trash and a half-empty case of bottled water on the floor. David had left cash beside the microwave along with a note telling Ethan to order food. On the kitchen counter beneath a coffee mug, I found divorce papers. David had signed his name in blue ink. The note on top was shorter. "Rachel, this is better for everyone. Vanessa and I are moving to Scottsdale. Ethan is more comfortable with you anyway." More comfortable with me? As if the boy were an old recliner he no longer wanted to move. I called David 6 times. He sent 1 text. "Talk to my lawyer." I wanted to throw my phone through the window. Instead, I made Ethan grilled cheese with tomato soup because it was one of the few meals he would eat when he was overwhelmed. He took 3 bites, then asked whether I was leaving too. That question did something to me. I sat across from him in my uniform, still smelling faintly of airplane air and diesel fuel, and said, "No, I'm staying." He nodded once. The divorce moved quickly because David wanted it that way. He signed over the house, gave up custody, and agreed to limited support payments he rarely made on time. He seemed almost cheerful during mediation. My attorney asked if I wanted to challenge the arrangement. Part of me did. Another part wanted David out of our lives before he could cause more damage. So I signed. The first few months were harder than I expected. Ethan stopped turning in schoolwork. He barely slept. The dishwasher, the doorbell, even the hum of the refrigerator could send him pacing through the kitchen. I learned to keep the lights low. I wrote schedules on a whiteboard. I stopped asking what's wrong and started asking what would help right now. Some days he didn't answer. Some days neither of us knew. Then one Saturday the robot vacuum stopped working. Ethan took it apart on the living room floor. 2 hours later he had it running again. He watched it move across the carpet, and for the first time since I came home he smiled. That was when I realized he wasn't broken. He was trying to tell us who he was. The following Monday, I requested a transfer to a reserve engineering unit closer to home. My commander understood immediately. "Your family comes first, Sergeant Morgan," he told me. "We'll figure out the rest." I don't think he realized how much I needed to hear those words. Life settled into a routine, though settled might be too generous. We weren't exactly thriving. We were surviving. Some days that felt like enough. Every weekday started at 6. I'd make scrambled eggs toast and the same cup of black coffee I'd been drinking since my first deployment. Ethan always ate breakfast at exactly the same place at the kitchen island. If I accidentally set his plate on the other side, he'd quietly move it back before sitting down. Those little routines mattered. After school, we'd stop at a small park near Oak Point Nature Preserve. I learned not to fill every silence with conversation. Sometimes we'd walk half a mile without saying a word, and somehow those were our best afternoons. One Saturday, while picking up groceries at Target, Ethan wandered into the electronics aisle. I found him staring at a robotics kit, not touching it, just reading the box. Again and again. I looked at the price, $189. At that moment, my checking account had just over $300 until payday. I stood there longer than I should have. Then I put the kit into the shopping cart. That night I skipped replacing the worn tires on my pickup truck. Looking back, it was one of the smartest financial mistakes I've ever made. Within 2 days, Ethan had assembled the entire kit. Within a week, he'd rewritten half the programming. Within 2 weeks, he was explaining problems the instruction manual hadn't even considered. I didn't understand everything he said, but I understood one thing. I'd never seen him that alive. His high school science teacher noticed it too. Mrs. Henderson called me one afternoon. "Rachel," she said, "I think Ethan's been hiding just how gifted he is." I've started wondering the same thing. She told me about a weekend robotics workshop at the University of Texas at Dallas. "It isn't cheap," she admitted, "but I think he belongs there." Money was already tight. The divorce had left me with the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and nearly every other bill. David's child support checks showed up whenever he remembered they existed, which wasn't often. I picked up extra reserve training weekends. I worked temporary engineering consulting jobs whenever I could. There were nights I fell asleep at the dining room table with spreadsheets still open on my laptop. One rainy Tuesday, my 14-year-old Ford F-150 finally quit in a grocery store parking lot. The repair estimate was nearly $2,400. I remember sitting behind the steering wheel wondering whether I should cancel Ethan's workshop. Instead, I called my older brother Mike. He drove 40 minutes after work with a tow strap and his usual sarcastic smile. "You know," he said while hooking up the truck, "Dad would have told you to fix the truck." "I know." "So why are you paying for robotics instead?" I looked toward Ethan, who was quietly reading in the passenger seat. "Because trucks eventually wear out." Mike nodded. "But investing in a kid like that," he smiled, "that's something that lasts." The robotics workshop changed everything. Most of the volunteer mentors were retired engineers, several of them Army veterans. They didn't treat Ethan like he was fragile. They challenged him. One afternoon, I overheard an older mentor named Frank laughing after Ethan solved a navigation problem that had stumped 3 college students. Frank shook his head. "This young man doesn't think outside the box." He smiled at me. "He doesn't even see the box." For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by what David had taken from us. Maybe, just maybe, we were building something far bigger than either of us realized. By the time Ethan turned 18, our garage looked less like a place to park a truck and more like a small engineering lab. Plastic storage bins held wires, sensors, and tiny circuit boards. Shelves were lined with soldering irons, rechargeable batteries, and boxes of parts I'd learned never to throw away because Ethan always found a use for them. My old workbench had disappeared beneath laptops, notebooks, and sketches that only he seemed able to read. Some evenings I'd stand in the doorway with a cup of coffee just watching him work. He wasn't fast. He wasn't flashy. He was patient. If something failed 20 times, he'd quietly try a 21st. Frank, the retired Army engineer who had become one of Ethan's mentors, liked to say, "Most people quit when they get frustrated. Ethan gets curious." That sounded exactly right. One afternoon, Frank called me. "Rachel, we've got something you need to see." When I arrived at the university lab, several students were gathered around Ethan's latest project. It wasn't designed for combat. That had never interested him. His idea was much simpler. What if rescuers could find people faster after a tornado? He asked. Texas had seen enough storms for all of us to understand the problem. His robot was about the size of a carry-on suitcase. It could crawl beneath collapsed walls, map unstable structures, detect body heat, and transmit live video back to emergency crews without putting firefighters or soldiers in unnecessary danger. I looked at him. "You thought of all this?" He shrugged. "I thought about people waiting to be found." That answer stayed with me. Months later, Frank encouraged Ethan to enter the National Robotics Innovation Challenge in Huntsville, Alabama. Ethan almost said no. "There are college teams." "So," Frank replied, "they'll laugh." Frank folded his arms. "They're engineers. They'll ask questions." The competition weekend felt like every youth baseball tournament I'd ever attended, except instead of bats and gloves, families carried toolboxes and laptops. Teams from MIT, Georgia Tech, Purdue, and dozens of universities filled the convention center. Ethan quietly rolled his robot to his assigned table. I could tell he was overwhelmed, so was I. Then judging began. For nearly 40 minutes, Ethan answered question after question. Not once did he rush. Not once did he try to impress anyone. He simply explained how the robot worked. When one judge asked why he hadn't equipped it with weapons for military use, Ethan looked genuinely confused. "Because it's supposed to save people." The room fell silent. Even Frank smiled. Late that afternoon, awards were announced. 3rd place. 2nd place. Then, the National Robotics Innovation Challenge Grand Prize goes to... A pause. Ethan Lawson. For a second, he didn't move. I nudged his shoulder. "That's you." As applause filled the room, Ethan walked to the stage, almost awkwardly accepted the trophy, shook a few hands, and came right back. He handed me the trophy. "Can you hold this?" I laughed through tears. "I thought you'd want to keep it." I've never liked carrying things. That was Ethan. Winning hadn't changed him. 3 weeks later, something happened that none of us expected. Frank called again. "Rachel, are you sitting down?" "I should be." "A major defense contractor wants to meet Ethan." The meeting took place in Arlington. 3 executives spent nearly 2 hours asking about the robot's navigation software, thermal imaging system, and disaster response capabilities. At the very end, one of them slid a folder across the table. "We'd like to fund further development." The proposed agreement was worth $4.1 million over several years, including research funding, engineering support, and licensing rights. I couldn't speak. Ethan quietly read the first page. Then he looked up. "Will the robot actually help rescue people?" The executive smiled. "That's exactly why we're here." On the drive home, neither of us said much. Finally, Ethan looked out the truck window and asked, "Do you think Dad will hear about this?" I kept my eyes on the road. I honestly don't know. Deep down, I had a feeling we were both about to find out. The first call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was changing the oil in my truck. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't saved in my phone anymore, but I recognized it immediately. Scottsdale, Arizona. I wiped my hands on an old shop towel before answering. "Hello?" For a second, neither of us spoke. Then David said almost casually, "Rachel, it's been a while." 3 years. That was his definition of a while. "What do you want?" I heard about Ethan. Of course he had. The local Dallas News had aired a short feature about the robotics competition. A couple of national websites picked up the story after the defense contract was announced. Ethan hated every minute of the attention. I just wanted to congratulate him. "No," I said quietly. "You wanted something." He laughed. "You always assume the worst." I looked at the open hood of my truck. "No, David. Experience taught me." He changed the subject. "How's he doing?" I almost answered. Then I stopped myself. 3 years without a birthday card. 3 years without a Christmas call. 3 years without asking if his son was alive or healthy. Now he suddenly wanted an update. "He's doing just fine." Before David could say anything else, I hung up. I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next week, he called 6 more times. Then he started texting. "I think we should talk. It's important. This doesn't have to become a legal issue." That last message made me laugh. It already sounded like one. Ethan noticed me staring at my phone during dinner. "Is it him?" I nodded. He quietly buttered another piece of toast. "I don't want to talk to him." "You don't have to." He looked relieved. "I wasn't sure if you'd expect me to. I've never expected you to do anything before you were ready." He gave me one of those tiny smiles that lasted only a second. Those little moments meant everything. The following Monday, Linda Holloway called. "I just received a letter from an attorney representing David Lawson." I closed my eyes. "Already?" "I'm afraid so." She emailed me a copy while we talked. David wasn't asking to rebuild a relationship. He wasn't requesting visitation. He wasn't apologizing. He claimed Ethan's defense contract had been negotiated using intellectual property developed, while Ethan was still legally his dependent. According to his attorney, David deserved a substantial share of the proceeds. I actually read that paragraph twice because it sounded so ridiculous. Linda sighed. "I know." He walked away. "I know." He gave up custody. "I know." He paid child support whenever he remembered. "I know." "So how does he think this will work? Because sometimes," Linda answered, "people confuse confidence with having a case." That sentence stayed with me. A week later, David arrived in Plano. He wasn't alone. His attorney wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. We met in Linda's office. David smiled as if we'd all gathered for lunch instead of a legal dispute. He looked around the conference room. "So, this doesn't have to get ugly." Linda folded her hands. "What exactly are you asking for?" David slid a document across the table. "My fair share." I looked at the number. It wasn't just a percentage of the current contract. He wanted future royalties, future licensing agreements, future patents, nearly everything Ethan might ever earn from his work. For a second, I honestly couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, hotter. I was angry enough to say something I'd regret. Then I felt Ethan lightly touch my arm. He hadn't said a word since we arrived. Now he leaned toward me. His voice stayed calm. "Mom," I turned to him. "I think Dad forgot something." Linda looked confused. So did I. But Ethan wasn't smiling because he was nervous. He was smiling because he already knew something the rest of us didn't. Linda didn't sleep much that week. Neither did I. Every evening after work, she'd call with another update. "I found one more document," or "You need to see this." The deeper she dug, the worse David looked. At first, I thought the case would come down to custody papers and missed child support. Those alone painted a pretty ugly picture. But Linda wasn't interested in ugly. She wanted undeniable. The first surprise came from the Collin County Courthouse. David hadn't simply agreed to let Ethan live with me after the divorce. He had signed a sworn affidavit stating that I should have sole legal and physical custody because I was better equipped to meet the child's long-term needs. Linda slid the certified copy across her desk. His signature. I looked at the bottom of the page. It was unmistakable. David Lawson. Linda tapped the paragraph with her pen. He also acknowledged that future educational decisions would belong solely to you. I let out a slow breath. So he knew exactly what he was signing. He absolutely did. That wasn't all. David had ignored nearly every scheduled parent meeting after the divorce. He missed therapy appointments, never attended an individualized education program meeting at Ethan's high school, didn't answer emails from counselors. The school had stopped contacting him after nearly 2 years because every message came back unanswered. I wasn't angry anymore. I was disappointed all over again. Then Linda found something that surprised even her. "Rachel," she said over the phone one afternoon, "did David ever tell people Ethan wasn't capable of working?" I laughed without humor. He said worse than that. "Good." I blinked. "Good." It means we may have proof. The next morning, she handed me printed screenshots from an old text conversation David had exchanged with a mutual friend. One message read, "He'll probably need someone taking care of him forever." Another, "Engineering, that's a fantasy." My stomach turned. Not because I was shocked. Because Ethan had been 15 years old when those messages were sent. His own father had already decided what kind of future he deserved. That evening, I debated whether to tell Ethan. Part of me wanted to protect him. Part of me knew he deserved the truth. When I showed him the printed pages, he read every word without speaking. Finally, he folded them neatly. I figured he thought that. "You did." He nodded. He stopped asking what I liked a long time before he left. That sentence hurt more than anything David had written. I reached across the kitchen table. "I'm sorry." Ethan looked at me with that calm expression I'd come to know so well. "You didn't do it." "No, but I wish I could have protected you from it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood. "I'll be right back." He disappeared upstairs. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a small plastic storage box. Inside were old birthday cards, school certificates, Army Challenge coins I'd given him after deployments, and an old flip phone. "I kept this." I frowned. "I thought it stopped working." "It does." He opened another compartment in the box. There was an SD card. He handed it to me. "I copied everything before it broke." Linda arranged for a technician to recover the files. The voicemail recordings were heartbreaking. Most were short. David canceling visits, making excuses, promising to call back. Then one recording changed the entire case. David didn't know he'd accidentally left the line open after ending a call. His voice faded for a second. Then we heard Vanessa laughing. David laughed too. And then he said the words I don't think I'll ever forget. "That autistic kid will never amount to anything. Rachel can spend the rest of her life babysitting him." The room fell silent. Even Linda, who had spent 25 years practicing family law, slowly removed her glasses. She looked at Ethan. "I'm so sorry." Ethan didn't cry. He simply reached over, switched off the recorder, and looked at me. "I think Dad forgot I remember everything." That's when I finally understood what he'd meant in Linda's office. David hadn't come prepared for a fight. He'd walked straight into the truth. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a chilly Thursday morning in Collin County District Court. I'd been in court once before during our divorce, but this felt completely different. Back then we were dividing a marriage. Now we were defending a young man's dignity. Ethan wore the same navy blazer he'd worn to accept his robotics award. He'd insisted on polishing his own shoes the night before. It was part of his routine whenever something important was coming. "You look handsome," I told him as we stood outside the courthouse. He adjusted his sleeves. "I'd rather be in my workshop." "I know. But this matters too." He nodded. "I know." Inside the courtroom filled slowly. Our attorney, Linda Holloway, organized binders on the counsel table with her usual quiet confidence. Across the aisle sat David and his attorney. David looked relaxed, almost cheerful. He even waved when he noticed us. I ignored him. The judge, Honorable Susan Whitaker, entered promptly at 9. Everyone stood. Once we were seated, David's attorney rose first. "Your Honor, my client is not here to take anything unfairly. Mr. Lawson simply seeks recognition of his legal rights as the biological father of Mr. Ethan Lawson." Biological father. Again, those two words seemed to be all David had left. The attorney continued. "Without Mr. Lawson, there would be no Ethan Lawson." Linda didn't react. She simply made a note. David's attorney went on to argue that Ethan's engineering interests had begun while he was still living with both parents, and that David should therefore receive a portion of any financial benefit resulting from Ethan's success. I glanced toward Ethan. He was listening carefully. No anger, no fear, just listening. Then it was Linda's turn. She stood. "Your Honor, biology is not the issue before this court." She walked to the evidence table. "The evidence will show that Mr. Lawson voluntarily surrendered custody, abandoned parental responsibilities, failed to participate in educational decisions, and repeatedly demonstrated that he had no interest in Ethan's future until that future became financially valuable." David shifted in his chair. For the first time all morning, he looked uncomfortable. Linda called her first witness. Me. After taking the oath, I sat in the witness chair. She began with simple questions. "When did you return from your overseas deployment?" "September 14th. What did you find when you arrived home?" "My stepson, alone. I described the empty house, the divorce papers, the frozen pizzas, the note David had left behind. The courtroom grew very quiet. David's attorney stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Morgan, isn't it true that you encouraged Ethan to view yourself as his only parent? No. Did you ever prevent Mr. Lawson from contacting his son? Never. Did you ever hide Ethan's location? We lived in the same house. A few people in the gallery laughed softly. The judge looked over her glasses. Let's keep the courtroom quiet. David's attorney tried again. Isn't it possible your resentment toward your former husband influenced Ethan? I took a slow breath before answering. I spent 3 years encouraging Ethan to become the best version of himself. I looked directly at David. His father spent those same 3 years pretending he didn't exist. Silence. Even David looked away. Linda called the next witness, Frank Dawson. The retired Army engineer walked confidently to the stand. He explained how Ethan had developed the search and rescue robot. No one built it for him, Frank said firmly. He earned every bit of it. Then came the school counselor. Then Ethan's robotics instructor. Every witness told the same story. One person kept showing up, one person didn't. By early afternoon, Judge Whitaker leaned back in her chair. Counsel, she said, unless there are further witnesses. Linda stood. There is one more, Your Honor. She turned toward Ethan. The defense calls Ethan Lawson. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear the old ceiling fan turning overhead. Ethan stood, straightened his jacket, and calmly walked toward the witness stand. Ethan walked to the witness stand without looking at his father. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He simply had a habit of focusing on one thing at a time. After taking the oath, he adjusted the microphone slightly. The courtroom was so quiet that even the clerk stopped typing. Linda smiled gently. Ethan, can you tell the court what you do? I'm an engineering student. And what was the purpose of the robot you designed? To help emergency responders find people trapped after tornadoes, floods, building collapses, and other disasters. Were you trying to build a military weapon? No. Why not? He thought for a second. Because I've seen enough people get hurt. Several jurors weren't present. It wasn't that kind of hearing, but everyone sitting in the gallery seemed to lean forward. Linda continued. Who first encouraged your interest in robotics? My mom, he answered without hesitation. Can you explain? When she came home from deployment, she noticed I liked fixing things. What kinds of things? He smiled faintly. Mostly things people thought couldn't be fixed. A few people chuckled. Even Judge Whitaker smiled. Linda asked another question. Who drove you to every robotics workshop? My mom. Who stayed up helping you prepare for competitions? My mom. Who paid for your first robotics kit? My mom. Who attended every presentation? My mom. Linda nodded. No further questions. David's attorney stood. He buttoned his jacket before approaching the witness stand. Ethan, no one disputes Mrs. Morgan has been supportive. Ethan simply waited. But Mr. Lawson is still your biological father. Yes. So he deserves some recognition, doesn't he? Ethan looked at him for several seconds. I recognize that he's my biological father. The attorney smiled. So we agree. No. The smile disappeared. My father and my dad are two different people. The courtroom fell silent. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The attorney cleared his throat. When did you begin developing this robot? When I was 17. So before your 18th birthday? Yes. And before you became a legal adult? Yes. The attorney looked pleased. No further questions. He sat down as though he'd scored an important point. Linda remained seated. She simply looked at Ethan. Ethan, is there anything you'd like the court to know? Yes. Judge Whitaker nodded. You may answer. Ethan reached into the folder he'd carried into the courtroom. I'd like to submit Exhibit 21. Linda handed the document to the clerk. Copies quickly made their way to the judge and opposing counsel. I watched David's attorney read the first page. His expression changed almost immediately. He turned another page, then another. Finally, he leaned toward David and whispered something. David's face went pale. Judge Whitaker looked over the document carefully. Mr. Holloway, she said to David's attorney, have you reviewed this? We just received it. Linda stood. For the record, Your Honor, the document was disclosed during discovery 3 weeks ago. Judge Whitaker nodded. I see that. She looked back at Ethan. Ethan, would you explain this trust agreement? After I turned 18, my attorneys recommended creating an independent trust to manage the defense contract licensing rights and future patents. Who owns those assets? The trust. And who controls the trust? My mom and an independent professional trustee. David suddenly stood. This is ridiculous. Judge Whitaker looked directly at him. Sit down, Mr. Lawson. He slowly sat. Ethan continued speaking as calmly as ever. The trust was created before my father contacted me. Linda asked one final question. Ethan, why did you create it? He turned not toward the judge, not toward the attorneys, toward David. When I was 15, his voice remained steady. You decided I wasn't worth staying for. Nobody moved. You don't get to come back because I'm finally worth something. David opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Judge Whitaker closed the file. The court has heard enough. After a brief pause, she announced her ruling. Mr. Lawson voluntarily relinquished custody and parental authority years ago. The intellectual property at issue was developed under the exclusive guidance and support of Mrs. Morgan after that relinquishment. Furthermore, the assets in question are lawfully held by an independent trust established by Mr. Ethan Lawson after reaching adulthood. She looked directly at David. Your claims are denied in their entirety. A wave of relief washed over me. David's attorney quietly packed his briefcase. David never looked at me, or Ethan. As we stood to leave, Ethan leaned over and whispered with the same calm voice he'd used weeks earlier. I told you, Mom. He picked the wrong fight. The courthouse emptied faster than I expected. Within 15 minutes, the hallway that had been crowded with attorneys, clients, and deputies was almost quiet again. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired. 3 years of rebuilding our lives had finally caught up with me. Linda caught us just outside the courtroom. I've got one more document for you, she said. What is it? She smiled. The judge signed the dismissal with prejudice. I looked at Ethan. What does that mean? He answered before Linda could. He can't file the same claim again? Linda laughed. That's exactly what it means. I squeezed Ethan's shoulder. Looks like you've been paying attention. I usually do. That was about as close to bragging as Ethan ever got. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered. Apparently, someone from the defense company had leaked that the hearing was taking place. Microphones appeared almost immediately. Mrs. Morgan, how do you feel after today's decision? Ethan, what would you say to your father? Ethan stopped walking. I thought he might ignore them. Instead, he turned politely toward one reporter. I don't have anything bad to say about him. The cameras moved closer. I just hope he learns that people aren't investments. That was it. No insults, no anger. Just one simple sentence. The evening news played it over and over. By the next morning, nearly every local station in Dallas-Fort Worth had picked up the story. One headline read, Local robotics student wins court battle against absent father. Another simply said, Army reservist helped raise young inventor. I secretly hated the attention. Ethan hated it even more. He asked if we could spend Saturday somewhere nobody would recognize us. So we drove to Eisenhower State Park near Lake Texoma. No interviews, no lawyers. Just sandwiches in a cooler and folding chairs overlooking the water. For several hours, we watched fishermen launch their boats while gulls circled overhead. It felt wonderfully ordinary. About noon, Ethan broke the silence. I kept thinking about something. What? When Dad left? I waited. I used to wonder what I'd done wrong. My chest tightened. You didn't do anything wrong. I know that now. He skipped a small stone across the lake. It just took me a while. I looked out across the water before answering. It took me a while, too, he frowned. I kept wondering if I should have seen it coming. You couldn't. I know. But parents ask themselves those questions. He nodded slowly. I guess kids do, too. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't David. It was one of the vice presidents from the defense company. We'd like to invite Ethan to our engineering center next month. What for? We're expanding the project. A few weeks later, we visited their facility in Fort Worth. Several military veterans worked there as engineers and project managers. They welcomed Ethan like he'd been part of the team for years. One retired Marine showed him a prototype rescue drone. Another introduced him to specialists working on disaster response communications. Driving home, Ethan stared out the passenger window. I think I'd like to work with people like that. You mean engineers? He smiled. And veterans, I smiled too. I had a feeling you'd say that. By Christmas, Ethan had made another decision. Without telling anyone except his financial advisor, he donated several prototype search and rescue robots to training programs used by volunteer emergency response teams across North Texas. When I asked why, he looked genuinely surprised. Because someone should. No press release. No cameras. No speeches. Just quiet generosity. That was the moment I realized the greatest thing I'd helped build wasn't a successful engineer. It was a good man. A few months after the court case ended, life finally became quiet again. Not perfect, just peaceful. For the first time in years, our mailbox wasn't filling up with letters from attorneys. My phone wasn't buzzing with legal updates. We weren't preparing evidence or worrying about depositions. We were simply living. One Saturday morning in early spring, Ethan asked if I wanted to drive to one of the defense company's testing sites outside Fort Worth. "They're running another field exercise," he said. "You'll probably enjoy it." I laughed. "I've spent half my life watching military exercises. This one's different." He was right. Instead of armored vehicles and tactical drills, firefighters, emergency medical teams, National Guard personnel, and search and rescue volunteers worked together after a simulated tornado disaster. Collapsed concrete slabs covered part of the training ground. Smoke drifted across the field. Rescue crews searched through piles of twisted steel, while instructors shouted directions over portable radios. Then someone released Ethan's newest robot. It disappeared beneath the broken concrete. For several long minutes, all we could see was the live video feed on a large monitor. The robot squeezed through spaces too dangerous for people to enter. Thermal sensors scanned every corner. Then an alarm sounded. Heat signature detected. Within moments, rescue workers located a volunteer playing the role of an injured survivor. The crowd applauded. One veteran standing beside me quietly shook his head. "I wish we'd had something like this 20 years ago." "So do I answered. He looked toward Ethan. "You should be proud." I smiled. "I already am." After the demonstration, several young engineering students gathered around Ethan asking questions. He patiently explained the programming, the sensors, and the navigation system. Watching him, I suddenly remembered the frightened 15-year-old boy sitting alone in our kitchen with a bowl of dry cereal. The difference was almost impossible to believe. Not because he'd become successful, because he'd become confident. On the drive home, Ethan was unusually quiet. Finally, he looked over at me. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "Why did you stay?" I blinked. "What do you mean? You could have started over." He wasn't accusing me. He genuinely wanted to understand. "You weren't my biological son." "No." "You didn't have to raise me." I smiled. "I never thought about what I had to do." He waited. "I only thought about what was right." The truck stayed quiet for another mile. Then Ethan looked out the window. "I used to think families happened automatically. And now, I think families are built." I felt tears filling my eyes. "I think you're right." A few weeks later, I officially retired from the Army Reserve. 23 years of service. The retirement ceremony wasn't fancy. A few speeches, a folded flag, some old friends. When it ended, Ethan walked over carrying a small wooden box. "I made something for you." Inside was one of the challenge coins I'd given him years earlier. He had built a simple walnut display around it. Carved beneath the coin were 8 words: "The person who stayed when everyone else left." I couldn't speak. I simply hugged him. As I look back now, people sometimes ask whether I regret anything. The answer surprises them. I don't regret the courtroom. I don't even regret the years of struggle. Because if life had gone according to my plans, I might never have become the mother Ethan needed. David believed being a father was something written on a birth certificate. Ethan taught me something far more important. Showing up matters more than sharing DNA. If this story reminded you of someone who chose love over convenience, I hope you'll carry that thought with you today. Thank you for spending this time with me. Wherever you're listening from, I hope you and the people you love know just how much showing up can change a life. The end.